All right. Welcome. It's great to see folks tonight. I'm Amy Antonucci. I'm the chair of the board of the New Hampshire Peace Action Education Fund, and I'm really glad to welcome you to our Peace and Justice Conversation series online on Monday, May 19th, 2025. Tonight, we are really pleased to welcome Harris Gruman from Massachusetts to talk with us about war, peace, and partisan politics. We'd like to start with an acknowledgement that we are doing our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homelands of the Abenaki, Wabanaki, and Pennacook peoples, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land, the water, and the people who have been in relationship throughout the generations. Quick reminder on Zoom guidelines. We are happy to have you keep your video on. We will have everyone's audio muted to start with. Note that we are recording it, so if you have concerns with privacy, you can change your name, you can keep your video off. It'll mostly be on the speaker though, anyway. Note that you can use the chat to ask questions all throughout, although we won't take them until the Q&A period. Later, we'll also allow hand raising, and I'll call on people and we'll continue the conversation that way. So with all that said, I am really pleased to introduce our speaker to you all. Harris Gruman is the Executive Director of the Service Employees International Union, Massachusetts State Council. His good work in the world includes leading campaigns to win union rights for child care providers and rideshare drivers, and founding and leading the Raise Up Massachusetts Coalition of Labor, Community, and Faith Organizations. This is a coalition that has raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour in Massachusetts, created the most extensive paid family and medical leave program in the US, and won a constitutional amendment to raise taxes on the top 1%. Good stuff. So he also recently joined the board of directors of Massachusetts Peace Action. In fact, he's coming here from a meeting with them, and is active in their Ukraine, A Time for Peace working group. I heard him speak soon after last November's elections and felt like his perspective was really useful, important, and a little different than what I was hearing in some other places. So I've invited him to be with us and really glad to have him. And join me in a visible welcome to Harris.
So, yeah, thank you for having me, and just setting things up here for my PowerPoint piece of this. But yeah, as Amy said, I mean, I've been, wrestling with this problem. I mean, I lead, the executive director of the SEIU in Massachusetts, which has 120,000 members in Massachusetts, mostly direct care workers, but also academics and lots of public sector people and janitors and security guards, and now a big new unit of rideshare drivers, Uber and Lyft drivers, who we now have created the possibility of a union for. So it's that'll increase our membership size considerably, because it's amazing how many people drive for Uber and Lyft. But at any rate, what I've been wrestling with is, I've been part of the movement, I would call it, all my life, the movement for peace, the movement for justice, and the movement for the environment. And I feel over the recent decades, in a very significant way, we've kind of lost our way around the question of partisan politics. So I want to try to explain what I think is going on there, because I think it's a very important thing to understand correctly, to be able to intervene in a positive way, and not, just create more divisions among ourselves, which I've seen terrible divisions arising among peace activists and labor activists and so on over the past decade. And in the face of like the Donald Trump presidency, we cannot afford that kind of thing. So I want to take us through a sort of a thought process about the relationship of peace and war to partisanship in this country. It's really a two-party partisanship, and also what the fiscal basis of that problem is for us. So it's sort of historical, and then kind of like a geography of the federal budget and the economy generally, and then look at the case of the labor movement a bit, and then look at where we are today. So I'll jump into that, and then we can have a good discussion, hopefully, after that, after I talk about it for a while. So first, I want to talk about war. Republican wars among people I know are always bad. And, I agree. They are bad. And if you look at the period from World War II on, you have a very clear sort of set of wars, right? So let's start with Eisenhower. He did a major buildup of nuclear deterrence that's led us to this, mutually assured destruction world that we've lived in ever since. He overthrew Mossadegh in Iran, which has given us a terrible history with Iran ever since. He overthrew Arbenz in Guatemala, another tragedy. He overthrew Lumumba in Congo. There's actually a very good recent documentary about that called Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, which I recommend very highly if you can get a chance to watch it. People have forgotten a lot of these things. They're very important. Nixon, bombing of North Vietnam, terrible. Bombing of Cambodia and Laos. The overthrow of Allende in Chile. Reagan, the Contra War in Nicaragua, the invasion of Grenada, the intervention in Lebanon. George Bush the First, invasion of Panama, the first Iraq War. George Bush the Second, invasion of Afghanistan, invasion of Iraq, expansion of NATO into the former Soviet Union. Ukraine, Georgia called for that, but also the Baltic states and so on. And Trump the First, meaning 2016 to 2020, strong support for Israeli expansionism, hostile actions in this hemisphere, very Monroe Doctrine, as he seems to be even more bent on this time, toward Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia. Okay, well, this is a history we all know, and a lot of us resisted all these things. But Democrat wars are what then? Good? So let's just review them a moment. Truman, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which even though that's part of World War II, I think those of you who watch the Oppenheimer movie or just know this history very well, in a funny way, it belongs to the post-war period, because in that movie, they showed when Germany surrendered, all the scientists said, well, we're done. We don't have to go ahead with this craziness. And they said, no, we have to go ahead with it because of Japan. And they were like, Japan's going to fall. And they said, well, we really have to go ahead with it to show the rest of the world that we mean business. Well, that's the beginning of the Cold War in many ways, and people took it that way at the time. The Truman Doctrine, by 1947, military aid to Greece and Turkey, to defend them from communism, which of course then never stopped for 45 years, the escalation of that Cold War, and the Korean War, a war of tremendous casualties, terrible thing. Kennedy, often held up as a kind of model of liberalism, started his presidency with the intervention in Laos, which very few people remember. Then the Bay of Pigs invasion, then the nuclear standoffs over Vienna and Berlin, which in many ways were just as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis, where really he avoided diplomacy in favor of playing a game of chicken with the Soviet Union over those two spheres in Europe. Of course, that then bled over into the Cuban Missile Crisis, which he deserves credit for fomenting and maybe for resolving without destruction, but still his war. And then massive escalation in Vietnam, which really, committed us. Johnson, of course, invasion of the Dominican Republic, back the coup and mass murders in Indonesia. I don't know how many of you saw The Act of Killing, that documentary a few years back, but over 1 million people were killed in Indonesia to keep communism out of Indonesia. Major escalation in Vietnam. He brought it to its height. Not that Nixon, it took Nixon a long time to get it down from that height, but he created the war as we knew it. Carter, proxy war with Russia in Afghanistan. We're, been dealing with that ever since. Support for Indonesia during its invasion of East Timor, which was a very bloody and human rights crisis. Clinton, NATO expansion into Eastern Europe. We had already promised we would not expand NATO into Eastern Europe. He expanded it into Eastern Europe. Bombing of Iraq, bombing of Serbia, a very destructive move in Europe. Obama, ongoing war in Afghanistan. He didn't end it. Intervention in Syria that, has taken a long time to wind down. And the invasion of Libya, which has left that country a shambles. And then Biden, and this is where things really reached a head. Proxy war with Russia over Ukraine. Cold war with China over Taiwan and the South China Sea. And a proxy war with Iran, which includes, by the way, Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, and arguably even Syria as zones of conflict between us and Iran. So these are the Democrat wars, and there's just as long a list, and they're just as horrific a list as the Republican wars. So what's this all about? I mean, why have we become party loyalists when it comes to war? Because I think until the Vietnam War, people were becoming more and more resistant to this sort of thing. But since then, we've stopped criticizing Democrats for their wars. And that, I think, is a really fatal change in our movement's relationship to even our dearest values. And why is that? I think the answer lies in the federal budget as a whole. So I want to sort of give you a little primer on the federal budget, the way I think it relates to this. And I call it geography now because it's not chronological. It's the power map of federal policy. So in the governmental sphere, what I always say is the 3 M's are everything you need to know about the federal budget. What are the 3 M's? Well, the first is millionaires. And why is millionaires part of the federal budget? Because our biggest progressive tax in America is the progressive federal income tax. It's the one place where we do a major job of creating a more just society by redistributing wealth from the investor class, the millionaires, to everyone else through the governmental programs called transfer payments. Millionaires are an essential part of this federal budget. Okay. And I'm really emphasizing this, and not the payroll taxes that pay for Social Security and Medicare, because those are like premiums you pay for a service. This is where we actually redistribute wealth. And where does it go? It goes into 2 big buckets, and these are the other 2 M's. Medicaid, which is basically care, the welfare state, if you like. And of course, a lot of things are sort of around it, little satellites around it, like education, SNAP programs, housing, you name it. But Medicaid is by far the biggest piece of that budget. And it is really the stand-in for the welfare state for our society. And the other is the military, which is gigantic. As we all know, it's nearing $1 trillion now of our budget. And so whether the money goes from millionaires to Medicaid or the military is always the dividing line, is the key moment of decision. Because, that's what government is about. Government is about like one thing. Actually, Bernie Sanders said this many decades ago now, almost, on TED Koppel. Said government is about who do you tax and what do you spend it on? And that really, I think, is a good summing up of what government is. So who do you tax? Well, to the extent you tax millionaires, and we tax them less than we used to, you're about justice. To the extent you put the money into care, into Medicaid, is how much you believe we're a caring society. And the amount you put into the military is how much you believe society is about projecting strength in the world. It is about power. And every dollar that goes into Medicaid does not go to war. Every dollar that goes into the military does not go into care for people. So you have to watch that dividing line to understand what kind of society we are. Now, the economic sphere is very important to all this. It's sort of outside the room of the federal government, but it's what's feeding it. So what I did here is I put down some key sectors of the for-profit economy that we have. And I've arranged them by color and geography again to be either sort of more on the peace side or more on the war side. Okay, and that's because that has a lot to do with why the military is favored so much. So the economic sphere, the profits from that feed the investor class, who are the millionaires and billionaires that we tax with the progressive income tax. And basically what you have is an economy split between peace and war, and a federal budget split between peace and war. Okay, this is my little map of our country in a way, our political map, the real political map. So what does this have to do with partisanship? It has a lot to do with it, because generally, and this is where the three M's become a great roadmap to politics, Republicans generally cut taxes for millionaires. That's been their general program for as long as I can remember. And here you have the billionaires for Bush with their satirical posters like, "Thank you for paying our fair share," they say to the working people. They generally cut Medicaid to pay for tax cuts to millionaires. Here are some of people like us protesting that. And they tend to maintain or increase funds for the military. Okay, well, we don't like any of those things, I assume anyway. One of you might object later, but I think we're usually in agreement. We don't like these things. Okay, so what about Democrats? What do they generally do? They generally maintain or increase taxes on millionaires. Again, not maybe at the level I would like, but they do it. And they are the origin, if you go back to Woodrow Wilson and Roosevelt and others, of our progressive income tax altogether. They maintain or increase funding for Medicaid. Okay. And here are people out there, good Democrats probably, look like members of my union, they might be actually, saying, it matters. But, and this is the rub, they maintain or increase funding for the military generally. Not always. Obama cut a little bit, but it always comes back. Even under Obama, it came back. So you see what we've got here. We've got a Democratic Party that does two out of the three things we think are good, but the third one is exactly the same as the Republicans. So we prefer the Democratic scenario over the Republican one, yet we would prefer, I think, if I'm speaking for all of us here, to tax millionaires and fund Medicaid. Basta, that's it. And what is that? I mean, that's basically what I would call the Swedish utopia of the 1960s and 70s, because in the Swedish utopia, their idea was from each according to their ability. We've heard this phrase before. And when I said it, to their ability to pay, meaning pay taxes, millionaires can pay more in taxes than the rest of us. And to each according to their need. And that meant there and here for care, the welfare society, the welfare state. And of course, a minimal defense budget. They do live in a world where sometimes you need to do something about that. Anyway, what was the result of that utopia? They accomplished something of amazing value. In 1975, people, in the world, they found that children in the top 5% of the income ladder in Sweden, and children in the bottom 5% of the income ladder in Sweden had the exact same health statistics. That is an amazing fact, and it has never been achieved anywhere else in the world. And that's quite impressive because it was not the case in Sweden, even, before World War II. It was actually a very brutal place for health statistics for the poor. So that's well worth remembering, the value, what that is about in real concrete terms. So back to our country, even if we vote for the lesser of two evils, and this has, been the mantra of my life, the left wing of the possible, better, this candidate than that candidate. Why do we feel we also need to support the full program of the lesser evil, meaning all three of the M's, not just the first two? Let me walk you through a little kind of syllogism or whatever, little logical thing here. When we attack the evil of the lesser evil, okay, the Democrat, we help elect the greater evil, okay? This is what is often said to us, right? If we say, I don't like what Biden is doing about Gaza, or I don't like what Biden is doing, with Ukraine or anything like that, people immediately say, well, you must be a Trump supporter. You're trying to get Trump elected. So that there's a logic to that. I mean, it's not untrue, but it is a kind of a mantra that's become in the last decades. Since the evil of the lesser evil is usually about war, that means we cannot attack the war policy of the lesser evil, that is the Democrats. So many of us voted uncommitted in the primaries, and some even in the general election, but again, came under ferocious criticism from people who are afraid of Donald Trump. So finally, since we cannot attack the evil of war at all, we cannot use war as an issue in electoral politics. Now that is profound and troubling. So this has been particularly a problem for the labor movement. And I'm going to say something about why more for the labor movement historically, but it's still extremely true today. So the labor movement and war, let me give you a quick history. Before the Second World War, most of the labor movement was for peace. And here's Eugene Debs saying it very bluntly: let the capitalists do their own fighting and furnish their own corpses, and there will never be another war on the face of the earth. The slogan, I've even chanted this at peace rallies: why should the poor fight a rich man's war? Okay. However, during the Cold War, something very different emerged, and that is the labor movement became incredibly involved with the armaments industry. In fact, the government really promoted the idea that if you worked in the armaments industry, you should be able to have a union. But of course, that meant then the unions were strongest in the armaments industry. And the labor movement had a kind of devil's bargain, which we called guns and butter, meaning we'll build the guns, you give us the butter. I actually think they borrowed that from the German Nazis, that slogan. But at any rate, something has changed greatly since that time. Since the 1970s, labor has shifted dramatically into public health and human service work, for example, but also education. Vast majority of union workers today are tax-funded workers in healthcare, education, housing, all kinds of good things, even just keeping the roads up and that kind of thing. They no longer are connected to the armaments industry, except for a very small minority who still work for Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and a few of these places. So labor should be ready to return to its anti-war roots. And so why has it not? What's been happening that really is why it should return, but why it hasn't? And I will call it, sorry that he's suffering right now with illness, but the failure of Joe Biden. Joe Biden's presidency, to me, is one of the great failures for the left in my lifetime. And why? He came in with this thing, Build Back Better. I mean, it was all about care, really. My union busted its hump to elect him because he was going to put $500 billion into direct care, like Medicaid, mostly. And it was going to be paid for by higher taxes on the rich and multinational corporations. Well, this was the Swedish utopia. We were enthusiastic. Well, that's not how it played out. A couple of Democratic senators sunk that program. but they shouldn't have been able to sink it. I mean, a president who can make deals and can twist arms and can horse trade comes out with half a loaf at least, right? This chart from the New York Times showed the on the issue of care, he came out with nothing. He had a $1.5 trillion program that was reduced to $500 billion, and the parts that had to do with families, as you can see, and healthcare and education, which included childcare, all of those were eviscerated. What survived were almost all subsidies to industries that were doing manufacturing, transportation, utilities, and climate stuff, EVs, all kinds of green energy type stuff. Those are not, however, care investments. Most of this, by the way, has been eliminated already by the Trump administration, what he did win. So when he failed with this in the first year, he turned, for some strange reason, he turned his attention to ramping up a new Cold War on a vast scale with Russia in Ukraine, China in the South China Sea, Iran in Gaza, Yemen, Lebanon. Well, where have our movements for the environment, peace, and workers been while all this has been happening the last 3 years? I would argue the environmental movement, silent. Almost no environmentalist would take any position on these things. Privately, they would, or as a non-environmentalist, they would, but not as an environmental group. The peace movement, divided. As you can see here, stop Putin, stop war. Unfortunately, that's a kind of contradictory statement. You have to negotiate with Putin to stop the war. But how many rallies for Ukraine saying we need to negotiate and stop the bloodshed did people show up with Ukrainian flags and all kinds of things? I know why they thought they should, but we were divided. We did not have a message that was unified. And too many of us were worried about Biden looking bad. And then the labor movement, well, that's really that. My party, right or wrong. SEIU for Biden here. But the whole labor movement, but particularly my union, gung-ho, never a word of criticism. We even criticized the Gaza thing very strongly, but not because of Biden, because of Israel. Biden was sort of left out of that. And then, of course, the other wars, no mention at all. Okay, so now we're in the disaster of Donald Trump, which truly is a disaster. He wants to cut $500 billion in care, in other words, to do the exact opposite of what Biden wanted to do. He wants to fund that. He wants to do that to fund tax cuts for the very wealthy and companies. And he wants to expand the military. Okay. Well, here we are wandering in the wilderness. That the golden calf actually has been renamed Daddy Warbucks. It's the big war contractor idol. And we're out there in the wilderness. It's time we return to some core principles as peace activists, but I would argue also as labor and environmental activists, which is there is no such thing as a good war. I will argue that even about World War II and the Spanish Civil War, to take two that I certainly understand the value of. Wars are not good. Diplomacy needs to come before war always. And this is very important because what gets revived and has been revived but more vigorously under Biden than I've ever seen is this argument about appeasement. The famous Munich 1938, where Hitler's whole destruction of the world and Jewry and everything else was made possible by diplomacy, the belief in diplomacy. Well, first of all, that's a crock of shit. I'm sorry. That is not what happened in 38 in Munich. It's a much more complicated story. But even if that were true of Munich 38, that's the only case of that you can really point to. And to use that to then say, do not negotiate, John Kennedy, with Khrushchev over Cuba or Berlin, or Biden over Ukraine or the South China Sea, is a complete misunderstanding of even the negatives of Munich 38. So diplomacy before war always. And finally, never elevate party politics above opposition to war. This is just my say, we cannot do this again. We've just been doing it. Kamala Harris said, if I get elected, I will create the most lethal military in the world. Lethal, she said. I've never heard a politician, no matter how militaristic, like Ronald Reagan used the word lethal before. We cannot let this happen again. And we learned this lesson during Vietnam. I mean, we walked, most of us, if we were alive then, or if we were alive then, we would have done it, walked away from the Democratic Party for a while because of the Vietnam War. But since then, we've never done it again. And it's become actually something more and more not allowed to be done. And I think if we don't break out of this, we cannot return to our true values as a movement.
Wow, thank you, Harris. Okay, so maybe people need to take a moment to take some of this in, but I don't yet see questions in the chat, but please do use it if you would like to ask your questions. We will also take hand raising. I wanted to say a couple things. I wonder what you think about this. It's been our experience in New Hampshire that after a lot of failure on doing this, we have started to make inroads in connecting with environmental groups and actually have built some bridges. We've just had our second annual Rally for Peace and Planet, which is a group of peace and environmental groups working together. So we feel like there is starting to be a shift on that, and that for a long time there wasn't. Are you seeing any movement on that? Do you feel like that's happening?
Yeah, no, I do think it's happening. It's happening in a sort of fragmented way, in the sense that I think labor right now is actually closer to the environmental movement than it is to the peace movement. In other words, there's been a big push to try to get labor to work for climate jobs and so on and so forth. So there's an understanding that that's something that we can work on. Again, partisan politics plays into that pretty well because the Democrats are generally for the environment and the Republicans are generally not. So, it fits the paradigm, right, of partisan politics. And that's why I'm concerned, because the peace thing does not fit that paradigm, and that's what's blocking us. I think the peace movement and the environmentalists have always gotten along, but we have had a lot of disagreement too about these partisan issues, because when we start criticizing someone like Biden, who clearly is better on the environment than any alternative we have in front of us, they don't want to hear it. I mean, it's like, don't do that. So I think it's very important that these things get addressed, because they're sort of the intrinsic blockages that are keeping us from really working as one. But it's great to, the relationships are always the beginning of any organizing. So.
Thanks. Mike, I'm going to have you ask next, and then I do see Summer coming into the chat. I'll get those organized.
Yeah, something that you just said, Harris, and I'm wondering if it would explain a question that I've had for a long time. So you mentioned that people walked away from the Democratic Party. So the question I've had for a long time is, why is it that since people were in the streets in massive numbers in 68, 69, 70, and 71, Nixon won with a landslide? That even though all those protesters were being targeted by the government got more votes, or the Republicans. And I'm wondering, maybe you just answered that when you're saying that they walked away.
Well, I think that is, what part of the problem, and this is the sort of dilemma we're in. I think you really did a good job just outlining it's like a moral dilemma. It's back to what I was saying about the lesser of evils. You can, as long as you hew to the lesser of evils, you might even think the lesser evil is good, isn't evil. But the point is, as long as that's your choice, you don't have another choice. So if you suddenly decide that the lesser evil actually really is evil, and I have to say, you read the history of the Vietnam War, you get pretty sick to your stomach about a guy who otherwise, again, was a real leader, Lyndon Johnson, a real leader on the welfare state, a real leader for progressive funding and progressive taxation and civil rights, by the way. And here's a guy who committed one of the worst atrocities in history. This puts us in a terrible dilemma. We walk away from that at a cost, which is unless somebody emerges like Eugene McCarthy or Robert Kennedy and succeeds in taking that mantle from him, we're not offering any real alternative. So the person who is offering an alternative, the Republican, then becomes the default for a lot of people, because they're like, I'm not going to walk away like these radicals, but I'm also, maybe they're disgusted. Maybe I should be disgusted. I mean, there was a lot of working class disgust with the Vietnam War that was not articulated as an anti-war position. It was more a sense of just, well, like the song Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival. But that, I mean, the fortunate son is the son of a millionaire who doesn't have to fight in Vietnam, but I do. So it isn't whether Vietnam is a good war or not. It's why is there this injustice? And, you know, Nixon did come in promising to end the war, much the way Trump has talked about ending wars when he was running. So, I mean, usually that's a kind of a bit of a fake, right? but it's not totally fake because, you know, frankly, as I said, Nixon didn't escalate the Vietnam War. He made it more brutal in some ways, but he didn't escalate it. He mainly oversaw the de-escalation, mainly because it had run its course, not because he was a good person. So this is the dilemma we're in. I think you really helped nail that down, Mike.
Okay, I'm gonna now ask Karen's question. Karen's wondering, do you recommend mass action to invite both Republican and Democratic Republicans and Democrats to declare themselves independent?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know if the labels are what matters so much as that I think that the first problem is, okay, we would like a Democratic Party that was an anti-war party. And there was a brief moment where you almost could have called it that when the Democratic Party was trying to rebuild itself after the Vietnam debacle. And that's why Carter actually was one of the more peaceful presidents, probably. Obama was similar from coming after the war on terror of Bush, you know, made him a little bit more peaceful than, you know, the Democrats otherwise are. But, you know, okay, the Democratic Party has obstacles to doing that. One of them, I've seen some things in the chat, you know, they feel they have to be more militaristic than the Republicans. You know, there are many things we could diagnose wrong with them. What concerns me is that our movements aren't consistent on it, that the labor movement has lost that consistency on peace that it had back in Eugene Debs' day. And around the world in those days, back when May 1st was International Workers' Day, you know, labor parties and labor movements were very anti-war. And, you know, that's a problem, but it's also a problem that environmentalists, who should be more worried about war than any other industrial thing they could think of, often are very quiet about war. And people are concerned about justice, like, again, the labor movement. You know, I spoke at a big AFL-CIO meeting about, you know, the importance of care work, you know, and defending Medicaid. And I threw in there a little bit of this 3M stuff. When I was done, a woman who's the head of the AFL-CIO in Massachusetts pulled me aside and said, Harris, that was a great talk, but please do not mention the military again. We still have members who work for that, you know, meaning at Raytheon. And I'm like, no, I get that, but, you know, that cannot be the reason we do not speak out against this horrible waste of money that is hurting more union members than it's helping. There's no question of that. So I think we need to work on our movements, and I think we need to work on our movement as a whole, because if you think about care work, it's kind of the intrinsic unity of the environment, war, peace, I would say in this case, the environment, peace, and justice, because care workers are usually Black, brown, and Asian. They're mostly women. They're low wage, most of them. I mean, we think of doctors and nurses, but the vast majority of them are not that. On the other hand, they also are green jobs. The people who do that hands-on care, like in nursing homes and do child care and so on, they are doing pure green jobs. They're not doing any damage to the environment. Even green energy jobs do some damage to the environment. And finally, their interest is completely with peace. Every dollar that funds their work and funds the care for the people they take care of is a dollar lost to the military. And every dollar to the military is a dollar lost to their jobs and to the care of the folks they're helping. So to me, that's like puts it together. But that's I'll just throw that out there as a big hypothesis. But it is true. I think the focus isn't getting Democrats or Republicans to run as independents, I think first we have to be not non not I mean to be sort of nonpartisan in a sense. Not that we're for, we're looking for another party even, but that we are independent. We are able to have an independent program, and we will judge the parties by it. And that might mean we still vote for the lesser of two evils, but we will let them know that they disappointed us, or we will criticize them when they're governing. We didn't do that with Biden. A little bit around Gaza, but even there, it was too easy to say that was Israel doing that, which it was. But it was also us. but no criticism of the China stuff, no criticism of what was happening with NATO expansion and all that.
Okay, so I want to ask you a question here. Is this what you're saying, that your message is really to us, to the people? And it's less about trying to figure out how to get better leaders so much as us being empowered to make whoever's there work for us? Is that kind of?
Well, I think that, yeah, and I think peace is really the linchpin issue, because it's the one where we failed the most as a big movement. I don't mean just as a peace movement. I think peace movement's been trying to do this, but the whole movement that agrees with peace has not been able to do this. And it comes in every stage of the way. It does include the electoral political work. My union endorses candidates. They put them through a lot of paces: questionnaire, interviews, forums with hundreds of our members. We never ask about peace and war. We ask about many other issues that are quite broad: the environment, even the abortion rights. I mean, there are plenty of people in my membership who probably don't like abortion rights, but we still, as a union, support them. So, why can we do all that, but we can't ask a question about peace or the military budget? It's a very disturbing thing. And
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it has to be fixed. I mean, it's a contradiction with our mission.
Yeah, and as you said, I mean, if we continue with these wars, we're not going to have an environment. We're not going to, I mean, this is
No, human survival is at stake, and our welfare state is at stake. Our sense of justice is at stake. We will not be able to help lift people up and solve problems of, racial and gender and class, discrimination and oppression and so on, if we don't have put the resources into doing that. And every choice for the military is a choice against it. Now, Donald Trump is that nakedly, but I would argue that the failure of Joe Biden is that in a subtler way. And I was amazed how people did not people in this room maybe, and certainly at Mass Peace Action, but most people didn't follow us in our criticism of that. They were still like, well, maybe next time he'll do what he said he was going to do this time. Otherwise, we get Donald Trump.
Yeah. I think you answered some of these, Trisha and Bill. I feel like yours were answered. Let me know if not. Yeah, there's more about the possibility of a third party, Green Party, or another one. And let me expand that to say, because there is, for instance, the Justice Democrats. There are groups within the Democrats that are taking this on. And what do you see? How do you see that fitting in? Is that useful? Is that something to support?
Well, I don't have a problem with the porousness between the Democratic Party and the movement as a whole. I mean, I think people have to be willing to do what I said before, rather than call it the lesser of two evils, which unfortunately implies that it's kind of evil, and it can be. I prefer to say the left wing of the possible. The left wing of the possible is different in every situation, and it's an art to figure out what it even is. But that's what we should be trying to figure out and make it happen. I think that there does come a time, and this is what really changed for me in the last 3 years of Biden, was we had gotten to a point where the left wing of the possible had become sort of impossible, meaning, I didn't see an alternative to Biden winning or, Kamala winning against Trump. I mean, I didn't know if they would win, but and they didn't, but I didn't know there was an alternative, even though I liked, some other candidates. And so we were in a real bind where the left wing of the possible was evil. I mean, in other words, it was sort of endorsing that most lethal military in the world. I'm like, how did we get here? You know, how did it get this bad? I mean, it took me back in a way to the Vietnam days. Now you say, are you that old? I went to Vietnam demonstrations with my dad. My dad and mother, both my parents were very active in the anti-war movement. And they took me to everything. So at the ages of 7, 8, 9, 10, I saw it all. I saw the big rallies in D.C. I saw the silent vigils on the Green in Amherst, Massachusetts. I mean, I saw all that stuff, and it had a huge impact on me. That's why I guess I'm always a peace activist first, in a way.
Great. I was gonna ask Moji's question. Moji, I'm gonna circle back to you. First, I think this is a quick one. Doug wants to know, is it the workers or the corporate leaders who profit more from war?
Well, that's the thing. The corporate leaders do. I mean, the Daddy Warbucks, as I said, that golden calf that I renamed Daddy Warbucks, they're the ones who really profit from it. I mean, you know, I don't know how many of you go back to the days when we were fighting for jobs with peace and so on. We had tons of information showing that when you invest in war, the money overwhelmingly goes to the top 1%. It goes to the investors, it goes to the companies, you know, the CEOs and so on. The workers do well in those factories. They're paid high wages, but they are not a big chunk of the working class, and they don't get anywhere near. I mean, my dad used to put it very well, actually. Say exploitation is relative. You'd say you see a McDonald's worker, you know they're being exploited, but you see a guy working for, you know, today maybe like $50 an hour in a Raytheon factory. You say he's not being exploited. He said no. Actually, if you look at the money involved, he's being more exploited proportionally than the McDonald's worker. Even more of what he produces goes to the top. And that's why they can afford to give him good wages and benefits because they're really raking it in. So I think that that's something, you know, and of course that's declining with automation. The more we automate all this stuff, the more the working class becomes expendable, obsolete, you know, and you see this talk more and more, like, you know, even the guaranteed basic income, which I'm not against, but part of that is, you know, has an implication that we don't need people. They need money to live, but we don't need them. We don't need their work. And that's a mistake because we do need their work. We just don't need it in things that make a big profit for armaments manufacturers.
Yeah, that is very true. Okay, we have a lot of comments and questions. Moji, I'm going to call on you. If you can be quick, that would be great because I have a bunch more here piling up.
Sure. Thank you. Hi, Brother Harris.
Mhm.
I am an Iranian American Sufi Muslim intersectional activist. We are dealing with intersectionality of many, many different things in the military, industrial, Wall Street, climate destruction, and, you know, complex. And so part of what I've been doing in terms of movement building, I am, as a social scientist, I have looked at this issue of what's wrong with this picture, and it's a systemic problem. Our civil society, besides political organizing, our civil society, our community is highly fragmented, resulting in peace, justice, environment, human rights, whatever our good cause, to be working in silos. So I have put together, with the encouragement of Noam Chomsky and Cornel West and Erica Chenoweth, the 3.5% lady, a, the theory and the praxis or practice of chambers of compassion in contrast with chambers of commerce. I would love to have you as a speaker in one of the gatherings that I organize for people of Iran and people of the United States to talk to one another. And they would love to hear inside Iran about your experience as a union leader, recognizing the need for people of different passions to organize our passions.
Well,
Hey,
So
Moji, thank
thank
you.
you.
I'm gonna,
I'll send you the information in the chat. Thank you, Sister Amy.
sure, thanks, Moji. So I have another, I'd like to put forward Heather's. I think this is important. I agree both parties supported war, which is awful, but what about how this administration has targeted many vulnerable populations like immigrants? Might it have been better not to vote uncommitted, but vote Democrat and then press for the end of wars? Greater numbers will be harmed under this administration. So I feel like, yeah, I'd love for you to speak to that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I hope I've sort of conveyed, I'm not a hardcore, like not a lesser of two evils person. I actually understand completely why we might have to do that. I will admit, just for full disclosure, I voted in Massachusetts for a third party out of disgust with this war stuff. If I had lived in New Hampshire, and certainly if I had lived in Pennsylvania, I probably would have voted for Kamala Harris. Why? Because it made a difference to do it there. It wouldn't have made a difference in Massachusetts. So I had a luxury that, I don't want to make too much of, because I don't know if I would have even abided by it if I'd been elsewhere. This is what I mean by the left wing of the possible. In Massachusetts, the left wing of the possible is you can vote for any party you want. It doesn't matter. You don't really have a vote. But in Pennsylvania, it did matter. Now, it didn't work. It didn't save anything, but maybe it could have. So because I agree that, again, that's why I did want to really lay that out. When you talk about war only, it looks like, what difference does it make whether I'm a Democrat or Republican? It's all the same crap. But when I look at it in a bigger picture, the three M's, as I said, there's quite a big philosophical difference between the two parties. One is much more a party of compassion, to use the word that Moji used, than the other one is. And certainly, a person like Donald Trump is almost the antithesis of compassion, personified. I mean, look, one of my members was famously now, abducted by ICE. That was Rumeysa Ozturk, and we really went to bat for her. But we always work for immigrant rights. We passed driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants in Massachusetts. So that was a big campaign I worked on. But these things are, again, more part of the welfare state than they are part of the military thing. But it is interesting that mass peace action has taken up the immigrant defense work very vigorously, because there is a militaristic aspect to it. It is relevant to anti-militarism to be against this oppression of immigrants. Immigrants are foreigners, right? There's a whole foreign policy kind of weirdness to it all. They're actually people who do hard work and live just like the rest of us, but they're foreigners. There's been a problem in this country for a long, long time, as you all know. So yeah, I would say that those are decisions we always have to make. But why, in the early stages of the election campaign, couldn't we have raised the issue of, why don't we explicitly come out for peace? Why don't we explicitly end what's happening in Gaza? Why don't we explicitly end this war in Ukraine, or lower the tensions with China? My union never asked those questions in the lead up to the election, because just raising those questions was feared as a gift to the other side. So we have to find that place where we can do what we do without actually being guilty as accused, guilty as charged. I don't have easy answers to that, but I think the further back we take it in the process, the more liberty we have to be ourselves and to express our values. And we don't take those liberties when they're available to us. We wait till it's too late, And I think that's another thing about election cycles now. People start worrying about the election the day after you win the election or lose it. You're already worried about, well, what's going to happen in 4 years? Well, that means there's no time ever to talk about what's the philosophy that we believe in? What kind of society do we want? Do we want a caring society, or do we want a militaristic society?
Yeah, great. And frankly, if they had listened to us, she might have won.
Well,
But
yeah, you don't know.
we weren't allowed to even be in the room.
Right. That's the thing. I mean, we were all closed out of many rooms in the last 20 years of electoral politics. We were invited in when we behaved ourselves or when we had only good things to say, and we were excluded when we sounded fractious or open to different ideas. Somebody mentioned in the chat, Bernie Sanders. I mean, that always was, like, whoa, got to put that out of the room. He's not even that radical. He's just reasonable. But,
I have one more question I want to ask you, and I feel like maybe I will ask it and try to wrap a few in this, because it feels like what a lot of folks get stuck on is, well, then who do we vote for? And I think what you're saying is that's not really the point. The point is the movement, the conversation, trying to influence the whole system, the society, etc., that we all get caught, that we get caught on, well, who are you going to vote for? But that's not what you're focused on. You're talking about all the other stuff. Is that?
No, that's a very well put. I mean, that's the trap that I've been trying to describe. The trap is, if it's about who you vote for, then if I say, I don't think NATO should have expanded into Ukraine, a friend of mine will say, what, are you a Trump supporter? Like, no, I wasn't even thinking about Donald Trump when I said that. But it becomes about, well, that he clearly is thinking about who he's going to vote for, and he's worried about who I might vote for, or who's someone who hears me, because he knows I won't vote for Trump. Someone who hears me might vote the wrong way. Well, that's an incredible censorship of our whole movement.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe that, I think, yeah, that trap is really interesting, and I feel like we keep falling in it, a lot of us. I have another one. We do have to end soon, but crises has been here for a while. How do we adjust the focus of our attention away from moving the government to do the right thing to moving the general population? What kind of actions will be most effective? And I also want to put in that I'm not sure that's what you're saying to do, but could you speak to those ideas?
Well, I mean, obviously that's, the important thing is to organize people. I think of organizing as happening basically three places. It happens in the workplace, through a union, probably, or not at all, through your where you live, meaning your community or your community groups. And that could be, with a focus on women's issues or whatever, or it could just be my neighborhood. And where you worship, and that could be broadly understood to secular things as well. Like there's places you go, like a church or synagogue or a mosque, or even a humanist society, where you go and you talk about big ideas, like political ideas. These are the three things that people do. Basically, they worship, they live, and they work. And you need to reach people through those three things. And in those three venues, people should be talking about war and peace, and they aren't. Generally speaking, they're more likely to where they worship. That's why our peace movement tends to be a little more faith-based, but they're not doing it at work, and they're not doing it. I mean, like my members, I would say, are pretty organically anti-war and pro-peace. They're care workers, right? They know, they know which side their bread's butter on, and they know that as, again, Black and brown and Asian people and so on, that war is not for them. I mean, it's not being fought in their interest. So, and yet it's not a topic of conversation in the workplace. It's not a topic of conversation in the community organizations. It's not a topic of conversation when we meet with candidates. That could all change if we made it a topic of conversation. For a while at SCIU, we were talking about Bush's war in Iraq, the Bush W in Iraq, and saying that's bad, right? Because it was a Republican war and it's bad. But everybody was like, that's right, it's bad. And they weren't just saying that because it was Republican. They were saying it because they really thought it was a bad thing. There was a waste of resources. It was there were atrocities that came from it. That it wasn't really a war we should be fighting. We need to be able to do that when it's about a Democrat as well as a Republican. So somehow we need to get that conversation going back where working people gather, and not just kind of this elite of activists that we are, but whether we're workers or not, but where most people gather, because you can do that to do what we did for Raise Up Mass. We did the $15 minimum wage, paid family leave, the millionaire's tax, by organizing where people live, where they work, and where they worship. Well, those were easy topics to bring up in all of those venues. But peace, sort of like that old joke Tom Lehrer said, it takes a lot of courage to get up in a cafe or a college auditorium and sing about things nobody agrees with, like peace, love, and brotherhood. Actually, I think people do agree. He meant, people do agree with those things. But for some reason, we don't sing about it very loudly.
Okay, thank you, Harris. I'm really sorry we're not going to get to everyone's questions. We are actually already over time and I still have some things to share. Maybe we can talk about having you back sometime because this clearly is a
Longer
rich.
now too, but I don't know. Maybe we're not rigid about the time, I guess.
Actually, how about this? Would you mind staying? I'll do our regular closing so people who need to go feel like they can go. But if you can hang on for another 15 minutes and anyone else like Diane, if you can stick around, then can we do that?
I'm fine with that.
Okay, then great. Let's plan on that. Let me just tell you all a few things. First, let me remind you that this series is free and open to everyone, but it means a lot to us when you donate and support us. And I think I just put a link in the chat about that. nhpeaceaction.org/donate is a place to go and figure out how. I have the links here for both Peace Action New Hampshire and Mass, so you can keep up with both of us. And I want to note that this and most of our Monday night programs are on our YouTube channel, so you can go back, especially for the person who couldn't see the slides. Hopefully they'll come out in the recording. Again, nhpsection.org, this time /events, was where you'll see a little bit about what events we have coming up. I'm going to give you a quick snapshot. Our ceasefire now vigils continue. Wednesday, May 21st, 2 to 3 p.m., we're at Representative Pappas's office in Dover. The next day, Thursday, May 22, noon to 1, City Plaza, Concord. And then Wednesday, May 28th, 2 to 3, we're at Senator Shaheen's office, also in Dover. I want to note that in 2 days, Wednesday, May 21st, 6:45, the film There Is Another Way will be showing at Red River Theater in Concord, sponsored by Not in My Name, New Hampshire. This is about Combatants for Peace, the group of former combatants, Israelis and Palestinians, who now work together for a just peace. So we'd love to have you